Good afternoon, passengers. Welcome to Martel Air. My name's Amanda, and I'll be your pilot for today. We're just beginning boarding for flight number 14 from Goulburn to Canberra, so grab your seats while I finish up the last steps of the pre-flight inspections of this Cessna Grand Caravan, the pride of the Martel Air Fleet. And we will be going into the plane as quickly as possible because the weather here is utterly dreadful. And inside the plane it is at least covered. And I can report that the weather in Canberra is just about as bad as the weather in Goulburn seems to be. So we should be having some more interesting flight weather as we did last week, and we'll see if anything interesting or dramatic happens with that. Okay, before engine start checklist. Pre-flight inspection complete. Parking brake handle set. Electrical system switches are off. Ignition switch is normal. Fuel tank selectors both on. Bleed air heat switch off. And then we have it not responding to my control inputs. Let's see if that wants to boot up now. How interesting. One moment. Okay, so please excuse me as I work out what's going on, but it seems that the throttle quadrant is not being detected, which is not one that is in my things to check for before starting the stream, but I think it's going to be from now. I am going to just pause the stream for a moment and work out what's going on with this, I think. And we are back. So, I am sorry about that. I will be cutting probably quite a bit of that from the recorded version of the stream. It turns out that the entire USB hub card on my motherboard has stopped working. I'm happy about that, as you can tell. Before engine start checklist. Pre-flight inspection complete. Parking brake handle set. Electrical systems off. Ignition switch normal. Fuel tank selectors both on. Bleed air heat switch is off. Power lever is idle. Prop RPM max. Fuel condition cut off. Fuel shut off on. Battery switch on. Cabin lights on. Cockpit lighting set. Flaps up. And no smoking light on. Before engine start checklist complete. The weather today is absolutely dreadful, and we'll be cruising at an altitude of about 8,000 feet, flying over Lake George en route. And given the weather, Lake George is likely to actually be a lake at the moment. Your cabin crew today is me, and your emergency exits are located to the back of the plane, back of the cabin where you first entered the plane. I also have a door up here by me, and if you see me leave, please follow me quickly. Our in-flight catering services are provided by our wonderful passengers, so I hope you packed something interesting. And my cockpit co-pilot, as always, is the excellent Wing Commander Lamington, who will be keeping an eye on the instruments and keeping an eye on me. Engine start checklist. Battery switch on. Beacon lights on. Avionics 1 on. Bus volts check. Emergency power lever normal. Inertial separator bypass. EIS readings check. Propeller area clear. Fuel boost switch on. Fuel boost on check. Fuel pressure low not shown check. Fuel flow 0 check. Starter switch to start. Ignition on check. Oil PSI check. NG stable. Fuel condition low idle. Fuel flow in normal range check. NG climbing. And NG stable. Starter switch off. EIS readings check. Generator load check. Battery amps positive. Fuel boost to normal. Avionics 2 on. Nav lights on. And avionics 2 active. Engine start checklist complete. We're now ready for departure, so please fasten your seatbelts and turn off your devices, apart from those used to watch this stream. Thank you for flying Martel Air. We hope you don't die. So, this is another airport where the control systems are just by communication, but we are right next to runway 22, so that's the one we will pick for takeoff. I don't think the wind should be too dreadful. Oh, it's a little bit spicy, but we should be fine. Yeah. Runway 22 should be as good as any other option. And if it turns out that it's not, we will turn that into a turn the aborted takeoff into a taxi to the other end of the runway, or try from the other direction. Goulburn traffic, Martel 14 is taxiing to runway 22 for takeoff. Okay, before taxi checklist. Taxi lights on. Seatbelt lights on. Taxi clearance check. Nav source set. Prop RPM to minimum. Fuel condition low idle. inertial separator bypass, and parking brake release. And we'll be using beta range to reverse away from the fuel spot where we've parked up. There are only 2 parking spots for Goulburn Airport in Flight Sim. But luckily we have this lovely big propeller that pushes backwards. But that one we do need to pull up the prop RPM to max. Come on. What is it getting stuck on? Well, it'll let us go forwards. Okay, that's enough room for us to just sneak through. There we go. And yes, as you can see, the weather here is dreadful. Which I think it might actually be outdoing last week's weather. Little bit of conversation on the air traffic control frequency, but that is Shell Harbour rather than Goulburn, so I guess we're sharing a frequency between a few of these. Okay. Before takeoff checklist. Parking brake set. Altimeter QNH set. Standby flight instruments check. Fuel boost normal, fuel tank selectors both on, fuel quantity check, fuel shutoff knob is push in, standby alt power on, anti-ice system not currently required, inertial separator handle is staying in bypass. Autopilot altitude set for initial cruise, which we may be adapting to other heights as we see fit. Flight level change enabled, set to VY. Heading mode enabled, set to runway heading. And bank mode enabled. Transponder on alt. Flaps to takeoff position. Takeoff clearance. Goulburn traffic, Martel 14 is entering runway 22 for takeoff, departure to the south. Takeoff clearance check, strobe lights on, landing lights on, seatbelt light is on, parking brake release, prop RPM to max, fuel condition to high idle. Before takeoff, checklist complete. And visibility is utterly dreadful. Okay, we line up. We peer in the distance at the windsock, so coming from the left and possibly a light tailwind, we will make do. Okay. Advance power lever to takeoff thrust. Climbing at approximately VX, which is 85 knots. Flaps up. And making sure we maintain this climb to get away from the terrain. Nav mode engaged. Let's get onto that nav path. The joys of rain that involves clouds that come down to approximately ground level. But luckily, the crosswinds on that takeoff was not actually too heavy. It was just a little bit of focus required. Okay, flaps are up. Setting cruise climb settings. Just making sure we're not overstressing the engine. ITT range is acceptable. And we are keeping the landing lights on in this weather, because any little scrap of visibility helps. And we're making sure to keep that climb going, because mountains are not good flying weather. So I think my first flight, Canberra to Goulburn on stream, was nighttime and dreadful weather, and this time it's late afternoon and dreadful weather, so we're improving. Someday I will get a Goulburn to Canberra flight that is not dreadful weather, but it is not this day. Now, I know that the Canberra, Temora, Goulburn, Canberra loop is a little bit small of a loop to be doing rather than our adventures along the New South Wales south coast and the Victorian eastern coast. But keeping to the plans, next week's stream I should be taking us Canberra to Garbo Island to Canberra in the Caribou. So I've got the paint job for the Caribou all nicely finished up. I think I'm I'm proud of what I've come up with for that. And the new acquisition is checklists. I have had my checklists that I've custom designed printed up on nice stout card on a flipbook, which is pretty much how actual Caribou checklists that I've seen were done, because I mean it's 14 pages of things and you want it handy. You don't want some big A4 book and, you know, the two-sided Cessna checklist that I've put together. Not quite enough detail for something with that little automation. And we are getting up towards our cruising altitude. Just keeping an eye on engine stuff. There's the 1,000-foot little chime. Melbourne Centre, Martel 14 is type Cessna Caravan, 11 miles southwest of Goulburn, 7,400 feet, request clearance to transition Charlie airspace. Squawk 3177, Martel 14. Cleared through the Charlie airspace, Martel 14. What's the wind doing? So we've got 16 knot tailwind and an 11 knot, 12 knot crosswind, so you know, a little bit spicy there, but it'll get us there sooner. Now, as you can see, if you look out to the left of the plane, you will see a slightly illuminated absolutely nothing, and also our wing, which is nice and firmly attached. And if you look out the right side of the plane, you will see yet more nothing, and again, a nicely attached wing, including all of the forward scanning, I believe it's radar in that dome there, sticking out the front of the wing, just because it can't be behind the propeller or the engine. So, you know, stick it off to the side, make everything nice and fun. And as we hit our cruising altitude, we set NG to 89, we set the RPM to 1750. Lovely. And there is our cruise settings. Now, according to the map, we are just coming up on Lake George, which is utterly not visible, which is always fun to have the thing that I was going to be talking about be utterly invisible. Well, it's not invisible, it's just not visible. That's different in an important way, I'm sure. Let's get pitot-static heat and stall heat on, given that it is 1 degree and wet, so these are prime icing conditions. Going to 124.5, Martel 14, goodbye. Canberra approach, Martel 14, 8,000 feet. So, in my trip away, which is the reason for my having a couple of weeks away from streaming, as we were coming past Lake George, we had the most fascinating thing where, as we came over the last hill on the highway before Lake George, there was just a solid block of pure white cloud that was sitting just on the lake and over the highway. It was very much just an object rather than fluffy white distance things like you normally get with clouds, which I found rather fascinating just because it was so solid. And then as we got past Lake George, we spent a decent amount of time in those clouds, and then it just started to thin out because so the northern end of Lake George is, I'm going to call it the shallow end, so it was the end without water in. It had cows instead, but the clouds were hanging out over the end with water in and not the end with cows in, so we just got to see it fade out as we came along. And it was actually rather fascinating to watch on the way past. Of course, on our way home again, when we were coming in the afternoon, no clouds on there at all. It was just, wet inside. The joys of mornings make for the condensation. We just had to stop to the water splashy noise on the outside of the plane, which is interesting. But it is definitely a shorter stream today, which, being the one that starts at 4 o'clock rather than at 12, is probably not too bad overall. As with last week's stream, there's no passengers awake to chat to at the moment, which is understandable. It's, I think, moving it from a late evening stream to some awful time after midnight for any of the Americans that we usually get into the stream. So, completely understand not being awake in the cabin for that, but luckily I do still have some company. But yeah, there's just a little bit more of my brain unraveling as I chatter away. And I am fascinated by the tech problems that I had while getting this set up. That was definitely a new one on me. So yeah, the nice 7-slot USB hub mounted on the motherboard is not responding at the moment. So I don't know how that connects to all of my earlier computer problems, but yeah. So nobody watching live got to see the stream be paused briefly, and anybody who watches the recording I think I will be editing that little chunk out. And of course, the frustrating thing about having nobody in the passenger cabin to speak to is that I still can't test out the live chat appearing in the stream, which I worked out all these technical problems on how to do that, and then all of a sudden I get 2 streams of nobody to test it out, which is, just how things work, I guess. And we are getting closer to Canberra itself. In fact, I think that is Canberra Airport coming up ahead of us, so I'm going to start the descent. I think I will get us to, let's call it 4,500. Not too steep a descent, but just something to get us down into something a little more reasonable, as we are, I think, about 8 miles out from Canberra Airport, which means I now switch over to the tower frequency, which I don't get the automatic transfer because of it not being an IFR flight, but that's okay. We're just going to stick with our VFR flights for all of this.
Canberra
Tower, Martel 14 is 6 miles northeast, 7,500 feet with information Yankee to land. Enter left traffic, runway 35, Martel 14. Okie dokie. So, left traffic, we want to overfly the runway and then turn left. I want to continue that descent down to about 3,000 instead. And we'll switch to heading mode. Set up an RNAV approach on runway 35. Zoom function also being how I turn the knobs is always entertainment. And good afternoon to one passenger awake in the cabin. So we are just coming into Canberra Airport. And that just zoomed us all the way out. And the weather is currently dreadful. So we'll be doing a lot of instrument flying for our approach just here. And as we've been given a left traffic pattern. Oh, and there is... Following the aircraft on the runway, cleared to land runway 35, Martel 14. But we are not going to rush into using that landing clearance because just because they've said cleared to land does not mean that we have to immediately point ourselves at the runway. If they wanted us to do that, they would have waited until we were actually anywhere near being set up for the approach before giving that clearance. We are in fact getting to the sort of altitude where we want to start holding, because there is some lovely ground just out the window. And it looks like the chat is actually showing up on the stream just over to the side there, which is lovely. It is nice to have that now actually tested. And there is the glide slope just coming up beneath us now. And also the terrain outside the window, which is, you know, nice and close as you want it to be sometimes for this sort of thing. Okay, approach checklist. Flaps to approach position, fuel tank selectors both on, landing lights on, prop RPM to max, fuel condition high idle, inertial separator to bypass, and brakes are off. approach mode set. And we've had messaging from the previous plane on the runway that they are now clear, which is lovely. And of course, as we get in towards afternoon into evening, the oblique lighting makes the fog even more impossible to see through. But we are on the glide slope. We are just coming up on the localizer. Okay, final approach checklist. Flaps to landing position, seatbelt lights on, and controlling the speed. Runway lights in sight. Hill before the runway also in sight. Trusting to instruments and the glide slope. Radio altimeter 720 feet. But just being very careful to watch our speed, because a stall here would be a single moment event rather than anything that would require recovery. And of course we're coming in with a tailwind. Autopilot off. Five to 10 knot crosswind, which is a little lighter than we took off with. And now that we're coming in, it just wants to float. And the wind wants to push us off to the side. Getting up to an 11 knot crosswind. As the terrain map goes red for good reason. Let's see how smooth we can make this. And of course, that wing wants to lift from the crosswind. And light braking, flaps up, slightly heavier braking. There we go, taxi speeds. And exiting the runway. And of course, with the upgraded Canberra airport model that I've installed, these taxiway markings are a lot easier to read. Going to ground frequency 121.7, Martel 14. Canberra ground, Martel 14, request taxi to parking. Taxiing to general aviation parking using taxiway Foxtrot Bravo Juliet, cross runway 30, Kilo Hotel Kilo, Martel 14. I'm not actually sure about that sequence at the end there, but we'll see. Just making sure we're clear of the runway. After landing checklist. Flaps up. Anti-ice off. The landing lights off. Strobe off. Taxi lights on. After landing checklist complete before taxi. Taxi lights on, seatbelt lights on, taxi clearance check, inertial separator to bypass, fuel condition low idle, prop RPM to minimum, and parking brake off. And yes, I have seen worse landings than that. I have also performed worse landings than that, which does involve seeing them. I mean, if there's a landing that you do that you don't see, that would explain it being bad, but the joys of a nice long runway that if you start floating a little, you can just let it settle rather than doing anything drastic. It really is such charming weather. So, this is Bravo onto Juliet. Aha, this is why it looked like a strange one. I do not usually take this route. And runway 30 is inactive, and we were instructed to cross it, but we just have a look anyway. And we get into the maximum wingspan 24 meters section, which is always fun because next week's flight, if all goes to plan, will be the Caribou, which does not fit into the Canberra Airport general aviation parking because it is junky. So we'll be using the parking that is just near the gates. Won't actually be using the gates for it still, just because it's the sort of aircraft that you use are the inbuilt ramp or small stairs to get into, not a jet bridge. But here is our lovely little parking spot. And some pigeons. And I think that looks good. Shutdown checklist. Parking brake set. Power lever to idle. Bleed air heat switch off. ITT range stable. Prop RPM to feather. Oh, that was in the after flight checklist. Fuel condition to cut. Lovely. Inertial separator to normal. External lights off. And seatbelt light off. Attention passengers, this now concludes our flight from Goulburn to Canberra, and we here at Martel Air hope you've enjoyed your time in our tiny skybus. Please wait until I have opened the door and you can calmly deplane in an orderly fashion and immediately get soaked. Our baggage handling services today will be provided by our wonderful passengers, so thank you for not leaving any of your luggage behind. Any personal belongings left behind as you leave the plane will be assumed to be a present to the pilot and the co-pilot, and enjoyed thoroughly. Thank you for flying Martel Air. We hope you don't die. Okay, internal lighting. No smoking off, cabin light off. Fuel boost off. NG is off. Avionics 2 off. Avionics 1 off. Battery off. And fuel tank selectors both off. So that brings us to the end of a slightly shorter than normal stream, which has been an interesting one for me just on the flying level of things. And here you can see the outside of the plane and the dreadful, dreadful weather. I'm in fact just gonna, let's just stand under the wing for a little bit of shelter and just enjoy the dramatic lighting and cool paint job. But thank you for the company towards the end of the flight there, and I hope that people enjoy the recording when it goes up and has the technical difficulties edited out. So, thank you to everyone, and that is where we will end the stream.